The wind screamed through the dark pines, carrying the sound of thunder that rolled across the empty valley. A lone man trudged along the muddy road, his boots sinking deep into the wet ground, his jacket soaked through. When a flash of lightning split the sky, he saw it, a small cabin with a single golden light flickering through the rain. And at its door sat a golden retriever, still and silent, its fur gleaming under the storm. The man called softly, "Hey, buddy!" The dog's tail twitched. And then, in an instant, it was gone. Moments later, when he knocked for shelter, the woman inside whispered with trembling voice, "If you saw that dog, you shouldn't be afraid. It's been guarding this house for 20 years, even after it died." The storm had swallowed the mountains whole that night. Rain hammered down in endless sheets, flooding the dirt road that wound through the pines. A man, soaked to the bone, trudged forward through the darkness, his breath visible in the cold air. His name was Earl Johnson, a drifter with nothing but a torn backpack, an old walking stick, and a heart heavy with miles. His faded green army jacket hung loose on his lean frame, his boots caked in mud. Lightning flickered across the valley, briefly revealing his face. Lines etched deep from years of wandering and loss, a small scar above his left eyebrow catching the light for an instant. When the thunder rolled again, Earl stopped. Ahead, through the rain and fog, a single warm glow blinked through the curtain of water. A cabin, standing lonely against the mountain. He felt a pull in his chest, part fear, part hope. His fingers trembled from the cold as he tightened his grip on the stick and pressed on. As he neared, the sound of barking broke through the storm, not sharp or fierce, but steady, low, protective. Earl squinted through the rain and saw it, a golden retriever sitting right at the cabin door, rain splashing against its golden fur. The dog looked alive in the lightning's flash, its deep brown eyes fixed on him. It didn't growl, it didn't run. It only tilted its head, as if recognizing him. "Hey there, buddy," he whispered. His voice cracked from the cold. The dog's tail moved slightly, a calm, friendly wave. And then, before his eyes, it was gone, fading into the mist as though the storm itself had swallowed it. Earl blinked hard, his heart racing. "Must be seeing things," he muttered. But something deep inside him whispered otherwise. He climbed the small porch, mud dripping from his boots, and knocked on the door. After a moment, it creaked open. An elderly woman with white hair and soft grey eyes peered out. She looked surprised, but not afraid. "Good heavens," she said softly. "You're drenched. Come in before you freeze." He nodded silently, stepping into the cabin's glow. The smell of pine smoke and old wood filled the air. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, its warmth wrapping around him like a memory he hadn't felt in years. "Thank you, ma'am," he murmured. "Didn't mean to intrude." She smiled gently. "No one intrudes in a storm like this. Sit down, warm yourself." As Earl crouched by the fire, something in the room caught his eye. An old framed photograph on the mantle. It showed the same cabin, the same porch, and a golden retriever sitting proudly beside a younger version of the woman. The caption beneath the photo read, "Buddy, 1999 to 2011. His heart sank. He turned toward the woman slowly. "Ma'am, I saw that dog outside." Her expression changed. The smile faded, replaced by a mix of wonder and sorrow. "You saw Buddy?" she whispered. "He's been gone for 20 years. The wind howled against the windows, and the fire crackled louder, as if answering her words. Earl felt a chill crawl down his spine, but he couldn't look away. The warmth of the fire no longer chased away the cold. Something unseen had followed him inside. Something loyal, gentle, and still waiting at the door. The fire had burned low, leaving only red embers that pulsed like a fading heartbeat. The sound of rain had softened to a distant whisper, and the storm that once roared now wept quietly against the cabin's wooden walls. Earl Johnson sat with his palms stretched toward the faint warmth. the wet cuffs of his faded army jacket steaming as the last of the cold left his bones. Across from him, the old woman poured tea into a chipped mug. Her name was Margaret Lewis, and she moved with the careful grace of someone who had spent her whole life living with silence. "You said you saw a dog," she said, her voice soft but steady. Earl nodded, staring into the firelight. "A golden retriever. Big fella. Looked real, sitting right at your door." Margaret's hands paused midair, the teapot trembling just slightly before she set it down. "That would be Buddy," she murmured, eyes lowering to the floor. "He used to wait by that door every night until my husband came home from the ranger station. Even after—" She trailed off, her words swallowed by the sound of the rain. Earl turned toward her, brow furrowed. "Even after what?" Margaret's eyes glistened in the dim light. "After the flood. It was in 2011. The whole valley was underwater. My husband, he tried to help a family down the river road. He never came back. Buddy stayed out there for days. They said when they finally found him, he was still lying by the door. Cold, still, like he was guarding the house until the end." Earl looked into the flames, the light flickering in his blue eyes. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. She smiled faintly, her wrinkles deepening with memory. "Don't be. He was a good dog. The best. Sometimes I still feel him here, like he's making sure I'm not alone." For a long moment, neither spoke. The room was filled only with the rhythm of the old clock on the wall and the sigh of the dying fire. Earl leaned back, his gaze drifting toward the rain-covered window. A movement caught his eye, something pale gold shifting just beyond the porch light. His breath caught in his chest. For the briefest moment, he saw it again, the shape of a dog standing in the mist, watching the cabin with gentle patience. He blinked, and it was gone. Margaret followed his gaze, but when she looked, there was only darkness. "He shows himself sometimes," she said softly, as if reading his thoughts. "Not to scare people, just to remind me that love doesn't stop when life does." Her words hung in the warm air like a prayer. Earl said nothing. He only nodded, feeling the strange ache of recognition deep inside, as if Buddy's loyalty had crossed more than just time. Later that night, Margaret showed him the small guest room down the hall. "You can stay until the storm clears," she said kindly. "It's been a long time since this house had company." Earl thanked her, his voice low, and closed the door behind him. The bed was old but clean, and the scent of cedar hung in the air. For a while, he lay awake, listening to the creaks of the wooden floorboards, the whisper of wind through the eaves, and the faint ticking of the clock in the next room. Then, somewhere outside, he heard it. Soft footsteps on the porch, slow and measured. His breath caught. He rose quietly, the boards creaking under his boots, and moved toward the window. Through the thin curtain, he saw it clearly this time. Buddy. The golden retriever stood in the mist, his fur shining faintly in the pale dawn that had begun to rise behind the trees. His eyes met Earl's, warm, knowing, and impossibly alive. For a long moment, neither moved. Earl raised a trembling hand and pressed it against the glass. The dog tilted his head slightly, as if in recognition. Then, with a single calm step backward, Buddy faded once more into the soft mountain fog. Earl stood there long after he was gone, his reflection mingled with the empty porch. In that moment, he realized something profound, that perhaps he had not come to this place by chance. Perhaps the lost were drawn to those who still remembered how to wait. The storm had passed by morning, but the clouds still hung low over the mountains like heavy thoughts that refused to leave. The air smelled of pine and wet earth. Earl Johnson stood on the cabin's porch, his hands deep in the pockets of his faded army jacket, his breath curling in the cold. The boards creaked beneath his boots as he looked out toward the trees, half expecting to see that golden shimmer again. Inside, Margaret Lewis was making breakfast, humming softly to a tune that sounded older than time itself. "You slept well?" she called from the kitchen. "Didn't get much sleep." Earl replied quietly, eyes still fixed on the fog. Thought I heard something walking around last night. She didn't turn from the stove. You did. That was him. Earl turned, his brow furrowed. Buddy? She nodded slowly, stirring the pan. He comes when someone needs help. Always did. You must have needed him. Her words sat heavy in the air. Earl didn't answer right away. He was used to being alone, too used to it. He had spent years drifting, moving from job to job, never staying long enough to matter. The army had taken the best parts of him, and life had taken the rest. He'd lost his own dog, a retriever named Duke, many years before, and sometimes when he closed his eyes, he could still feel the weight of that head resting on his knee. Now, standing on this porch, it all came back. The loyalty, the silence, the goodbye he never got to say. He rubbed the scar above his left eyebrow, a habit when his thoughts grew too loud. Inside the cabin, the smell of fried eggs and coffee mixed with the scent of wet pine. He stepped back in, his boots leaving faint muddy prints on the wooden floor. Margaret looked up and smiled, her kind grey eyes meeting his. You've been running a long time, haven't you? She asked gently. Seems that way, he replied, pulling out a chair. And somehow, you ended up here, she said, setting a plate before him. Buddy doesn't lead people here by accident. Earl looked down at his food, unsure how to respond. You think a ghost dog led me through a storm? He said, with a small, tired smile. I think love leads us where we're supposed to go, she answered simply. He didn't argue, he couldn't. Outside, the fog began to lift, revealing the mountain ridges draped in silver light. For the first time in years, Earl felt still, not restless, not lost. After breakfast, he stepped outside again. The forest dripped with dew, birds started to sing cautiously, and the world seemed to breathe again. That's when he saw it, a paw print in the mud, fresh, large, definite. He knelt, tracing it gently with his fingers. Buddy, he whispered. The wind stirred the branches above, and for a heartbeat, he thought he heard the faint jingle of a dog's collar carried on the breeze. Then, from the tree line, movement. A flash of gold between the ferns. He rose slowly, heart pounding, watching as the familiar figure emerged through the mist. The golden retriever, his fur radiant in the pale morning light, stood at the edge of the clearing. He didn't bark or move. He simply stood there, watching. Earl felt a lump in his throat. You're real, he whispered. Aren't you? The dog tilted his head, eyes full of peace and something more. Understanding. Then he turned, walking slowly toward the forest trail that wound up the mountain. Earl hesitated only a second before following, the mud soft under his boots, the air thick with something sacred. The deeper he went into the woods, the quieter the world became. Only the soft sound of the retriever's paws and his own footsteps echoed in the mist. It felt less like a chase and more like a calling. The forest grew quieter the higher Earl climbed. The air was thin and cold, filled with the scent of wet pine and old secrets. Mist rolled between the trees like pale smoke, curling around the roots and stones. He followed the path Buddy had taken, each footprint vanishing almost as soon as he saw it, as if the world itself was guiding him forward. His breath came slow, visible in the cold morning light. The pine walking stick tapped softly on the muddy ground, a rhythm steadying his steps. He had followed trails before, as a soldier, as a man searching for work, as a soul chasing something he could never name. But never one that felt like this. This one pulled at something deep in his chest. The golden retriever walked ahead in perfect silence, its golden fur bright even under the grey sky, tail moving slowly like a pendulum of time. From a distance, it looked alive, whole, real. Yet each time Earl blinked, its form seemed to shimmer, just slightly, like heat over a desert road. The forest opened into a small clearing where sunlight broke through the clouds, spilling gold across the mossy ground. There, in the center, was an old wooden cross, weathered, moss-covered, leaning slightly to one side. The earth around it was covered with fallen pine needles, and at its base sat a rusty dog collar with a faded tag that read, Buddy. Earl froze. He took a slow step forward, the mud sucking at his boots. "You've been here all along," he whispered, his voice breaking the stillness. The golden retriever stopped beside the grave, head bowed slightly, eyes full of something deeper than sadness. A quiet knowing. Earl knelt, his knees sinking into the wet ground. He reached out, brushing his fingers across the collar, feeling the cold metal beneath the rust. It was real. Every part of it was real. The mist swirled gently around him, and for a moment he felt a warmth on his shoulder, like a breath of sunlight cutting through the cold. He turned, and Buddy was closer now, so close he could see every strand of its fur, the white patch on its chest gleaming faintly. Earl's throat tightened. "You stayed," he said softly. "All these years. You stayed." The dog didn't move, but its eyes glistened, as if it understood. A breeze moved through the trees, scattering pine needles across the ground, carrying the faint chime of metal. The sound of the collar shifting. Earl's memories spilled back all at once. The soldiers he'd buried, the dogs he'd left behind, the nights he'd slept under bridges wishing for one more chance to feel trusted again. "I left everyone who ever cared for me," he murmured, tears mixing with the rain. "And here you are, still watching over someone else." He looked up into the grey sky. The mist had begun to lift, and for the first time, sunlight reached the clearing completely, surrounding Buddy in a halo of gold. The golden retriever took one slow step forward, pressing its muzzle gently against Earl's hand. Warm, soft, impossibly real. Earl closed his eyes, letting the warmth stay a moment longer. When he opened them again, the dog was gone. Only the collar remained at the base of the cross. But this time, he didn't feel alone. The wind carried something through the trees. Not a whisper, not a sound, but a feeling. Gratitude. He stood, brushing the mud from his knees, and looked toward the distant valley below. The storm had cleared. For the first time in years, Earl smiled. Not because the ghost was gone, but because the love that bound it here had never really left. He picked up the collar gently and whispered, "Rest easy, boy." Then, with the sun warming his face, he started back down the mountain, the echo of footsteps, one man and one loyal dog, fading softly behind him. When Earl returned to the cabin, the light had changed. The mist that once haunted the forest had lifted, and the world now glowed with the soft gold of late afternoon. He walked slowly, boots heavy with mud, the rusty dog collar clutched in his hand. The wind whispered through the pines like a hymn. Margaret Lewis was sitting by the window when he entered. She looked up, her grey eyes wide, a tremor of recognition in them before she even saw what he carried. "You found him," she said quietly. Earl nodded, his voice thick. "Up on the ridge. There's a cross. The ground's covered in pine needles, but he's there." He opened his hand and placed the collar on the table between them. The faded tag still read, Buddy. Margaret reached out with trembling fingers, tracing the letters as if they were the face of an old friend. "My husband built that cross," she whispered. "He buried him there himself after the flood." She smiled sadly. "I couldn't bring myself to go back." For a while, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the ticking of the old clock on the mantle and the crackle of the fire. Then Margaret said softly, "He must have led you there for a reason." Earl's gaze fell to the floor. "Maybe to remind me what loyalty looks like." He sat down across from her, leaning his pine walking stick against the wall. "I've spent a long time running from things, ma'am. War, guilt, even myself. But that dog," his voice faltered. "He didn't run. He stayed." Margaret looked at him, her eyes glistening. "Buddy always knew when someone was lost. Maybe he saw something in you too." Earl let out a tired laugh. "A washed-up drifter with no one left?" She smiled gently. "Maybe a man who needed a place to stop running." Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting amber light across the cabin walls. Earl stared out through the window, where rain had dried into streaks on the glass. For a moment, he saw movement. The faint shimmer of golden fur crossing the yard, sunlight catching it like a spark. His breath caught. "He's here," he murmured. Margaret turned, but saw nothing. "He comes when he's needed," she said softly. "Always has." Earl rose slowly, walking to the door. The air outside was cool and still. At the edge of the trees, he saw the silhouette again. The same golden retriever, head held high, tail swaying gently. This time there was no fear. No question of ghosts. Only peace. Earl stepped off the porch, stopping a few feet away. "Thank you," he whispered. The dog stood still for a heartbeat, then turned toward the woods, where sunlight streamed through the branches like a path of gold. Earl watched as the retriever walked into the light until it faded completely, leaving only the sound of birds returning to the trees. He stood there for a long time, the collar warm in his palm, the ache in his chest no longer heavy, but whole. When he went back inside, Margaret was still sitting by the fire, humming softly. She looked up as he entered. "You should stay a while," she said gently. "It's been years since this house had company." Earl smiled faintly and nodded. "Maybe I will." He hung the collar beside the fireplace, just above the old photograph of Buddy and Margaret's husband, where the firelight could touch it every night. Later, as the sky darkened to deep blue, Earl sat by the window, watching the last traces of gold fade from the trees. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. Not because he'd found shelter from a storm, but because he'd found the kind of faith only loyalty leaves behind. Outside, a gentle wind passed through the forest, and somewhere far off, he thought he heard a single bark echo through the hills. Soft, familiar, and full of love. Morning sunlight poured gently through the cabin's small windows, painting golden lines across the wooden floor. The storm had passed completely. The air smelled of pine and clean rain, and for the first time in years, Earl Johnson woke to silence that didn't hurt. He sat up slowly from the old sofa near the fire, rubbing his eyes as the first birds began to sing outside. Margaret Lewis was already in the kitchen, her movements calm and familiar. The scent of coffee drifted through the room, wrapping around him like comfort. She turned with a smile. "You slept well," she said softly. Earl nodded. "Better than I have in a long time." He looked toward the fireplace where the rusty collar still hung, catching the light. For a moment, it almost seemed to glow. "You planning to stay for a while?" Margaret asked as she poured him a cup. He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, maybe I will. Feels like this place still needs someone to keep the fire going." Margaret smiled knowingly. "Then maybe you were meant to find it." The morning moved gently, full of small, ordinary sounds. The crackle of firewood, the clink of the coffee cup, the wind brushing softly against the window. Outside, sunlight poured over the valley, glistening on wet leaves and rocks. After breakfast, Earl stepped outside with his pine walking stick. The world was quiet, but alive. The forest that had once felt haunted now shimmered with warmth. Every tree, every drop of dew seemed to carry a memory. He walked slowly to the edge of the yard, where the ground sloped toward the valley. There, standing at the edge of the sunlight, was the golden retriever. Buddy. The dog's fur shimmered gold in the morning glow, the white patch on its chest brighter than before. It stood still, tail wagging slowly, brown eyes soft and proud. Earl froze. "You're still here," he whispered. The dog stepped forward, paws making no sound on the wet grass. Earl knelt, his breath catching. "I don't know why you chose me, Buddy, but thank you." For a moment, warmth passed through the air like a living breath, and he felt it. The gentle brush of fur against his hand. Then, as sunlight grew stronger, the golden retriever turned, walking toward the forest edge one last time. Light gathered around it until its shape faded completely into the brightness. Earl stayed kneeling long after it vanished, the air around him glowing with peace. He smiled through the tears, whispering, "Good boy." When he returned inside, Margaret was looking out the window. "He came, didn't he?" she asked quietly. Earl nodded, his voice low. "Yeah, but he's gone now." She smiled faintly. "No, he's not. Some souls don't leave. They just change how they stay." That evening, Earl sat by the fireplace, the collar hanging beside the photo, the firelight flickering across his face. Outside, the last light of day turned the world to gold. He felt the warmth of it seep into his chest, a warmth that didn't fade this time. When night came, he opened the window. The wind carried the faintest sound, a bark, distant but familiar, drifting through the trees before fading into the stars. Earl smiled. For the first time in decades, he didn't feel like a wanderer anymore. The storm had given him shelter, the ghost had given him purpose, and the dog that waited 20 years at a door had given him home.